you love movies and movie discussions, you've come to the right place. Who am I, you ask? I am the Wiz, and I'm here today to review the 1986 erotic drama Betty Blue, starring Beatrice Dalle and Jean-Jacques Anglade, directed by Jean-Jacques Beineix. I probably killed all those names since I am not French. I am so sorry if that is the case. But anyway, man, I gotta work on that, actually, now come to think of it. Erotic dramas used to be a big thing, I think, around the 80s and 90s. There was a lot of them that came out. There's a series on the podcast, you must remember this, called the Erotic 80s and Erotic 90s, and there were a bunch of big movies that were erotic dramas. They've kind of fallen out of favor a little bit here, and I think a lot of people think it's because we've become a lot more sensitive to nudity, and we've become a lot more sensitive to sex in movies. I don't really think that's the real reason. I think it's because porn is so prevalent now, and it's so easy to actually access, that the desire to see naked flesh on screen has diminished greatly at this point. I watched this movie, Betty Blue, and I've heard all the explicit sex scenes in this movie, the amount of nudity in the movie, and I gotta be honest with you, I had no effect. I had zero effect to it. I was like, oh, okay, yeah, that's some boobs. That's a penis. Yep. Uh-huh. And apparently, the sex scenes in this movie are unsimulated. Now, what that means is that they're actually having sex on screen. And honestly, again, nothing. I was like, oh, they're having sex. And I was just like, yep, okay, cool. I guess that might be the reason to me as to why. I don't think it's because we've become more prudish as a society. I just think that there is, like, honestly, I can go on Twitter right now and just scroll my feed, and then I will come across a thirst trap post, and boom, there's porn in every type of comment. So I really do not think that we've become more prudish as a society, and that's why we're having less erotic dramas and less types of sex movies. It's mainly because it's everywhere, and it's not really that amazing when you see it, or it's not really that shocking, really, because you can just go on your phone and boom, there it is. Go into Pornhub and get what you want. But anyway, let's talk about Betty Blue. This is the story of Zorg, played by Jean-Jacques Anglade, and Betty, played by Beatrice Dalle. And this is a romance that happens suddenly, and the movie is basically about that. It's about how Zorg meets Betty and how he has to deal with her erratic behavior, but you'll find out as to why Betty is so erratic as the film moves on. The first thing you're going to notice when you watch Betty Blue, that it's visually and stylistically a very romantic film. Now, the film is supposed to be a romance film, but I don't think the film is all that romantic. It does show romance in the story, of course, because that's what the main story is about. But what I mean by the film being visually and stylistically romantic is that it's very exaggerated. There's a lot of beautiful scenery in the movie. It's bathed in orange and blue and a very exaggerated palette that you're dealing with as you're watching the film. And it's, honestly, in some scenes, it's gorgeous. It actually reminds me a lot of the umbrellas of Cherbourg when it comes to its visuals. Bright colors that accentuate certain things. Even scenes that are in not great areas, or I would say in apartments that are not well kept, have a very distinct and bright color scheme that just really pops when you watch the movie. The other thing that's very exaggerated in the movie are the performances. I think Anglade as Zorg is probably the most muted of the performances, even though I still think it's exaggerated in some ways. But I think the one performance that you would have to talk about with exaggeration is Beatrice Dalle's performance as Betty, which I think is exceptional. This is a really good performance by Beatrice Dalle. I believed every time that she had her mood swings and how she would go back and forth in her states, where she would be exceptionally happy and then all of a sudden just go completely psychotic in another scene in this film. It is a singular performance that is tailor-made to the movie. And just because of the way the film is shot and how it's presenting itself, her performance is incredible in this movie. And if there is one reason I'd say if you have to watch it, I think it's for this performance as well. It's a very brave performance, too. This woman is nude in, like, a good amount of the film. Like, even for when there's no reason for her to be nude, she's nude. Or she's topless or whatever. But, like, it's a very brave performance because it just seems like she is incredibly comfortable just being like that. And maybe she is, and this really has a lot to do with Betty, but it seems like in this performance, it's like the nudity doesn't bother her, or it's just a very matter of fact. It's just part of that character, and it really works well with Dalle's performance in this movie. That said, I do have to talk about the story, and the story's a very slow and deliberate burn of a story that honestly I don't think amounts to much as the movie's going on. I would say the first 2 acts of the film is basically of course, the start of the romance, because the first thing that you see in the movie is basically the 2 characters having sex. You know right away what the movie is. This is a very passionate, very physical, very sexual type of relationship that they have. And they really communicate their love to each other through sex, essentially, in this movie. There's other things that they do in this movie as well that will show that there is a more substantive relationship to a certain extent, but what you see the most out of this when it comes to their relationship is sex. But because of that, there isn't much depth to either character. There's more depth to Betty than anybody else, but everybody else, including Zorg in this movie, the depth isn't as pronounced as you would like it in this movie. I found that as the movie goes on, I was enraptured by Betty in the movie, but bored by everybody else. And this is from the first 2 acts of the film. And it's a very slow, deliberate type of burn that is going through the film, which normally I don't mind. I don't mind a film that has a slow burn as long as the 3rd act pays off that burn. Now, the 3rd act is where it starts to pick up, but the film also starts to fall apart. The 3rd act is where you start to find out what exactly is wrong with Betty. And Dalle's performance in this movie really ratchets up. I think it's probably some of the best scenes that she's in this movie is in the 3rd act, and it's really something to watch when she starts to fall apart as the film goes on. The problem is what happens with Zorg in this movie, and I'm not going to spoil what happens with Zorg, but it really treads on the ridiculousness. And honestly, as I was watching the film and things were going on in the film with Zorg, I was like, oh God, what? Why go in this direction? Now, some will look at it as it's kind of the style of the film. It's a very romantic, very exaggerated type of film, but I don't think there was really an expectation there of where the direction that the film goes in that, and I don't think it pays off from the first 2 acts. Honestly, I'll put it this way. What happens in the 3rd act feels like it's trying to justify what happens at the end of the film, and none of it, to me, works. It really tries to evoke a dramatic power that, when it happens, I don't think pays off and is just not there for me. I think visually and stylistically, it's a very fascinating movie. But once you put into the story and you get into the characters in this movie, Betty is really the only character that I actually had an attachment to, that I actually liked watching. But the rest of it is just nothing there for me at all. I didn't really engage with any of the characters. I didn't particularly like Zorg too much. I didn't hate him either, but he was just kind of a character to a certain extent. I was very underwhelmed by the end of the story and the direction that the film went in. All right, so let's get into the footnotes for Betty Blue. My first footnote: could they have come up with a better title for this? Now, to be fair, the original title of the book is 37.2 Celsius le matin, which is 37.2 Celsius in the morning, which, if you're going to translate that to English, is 98 degrees in the morning, which I think would not be a great title either. So, I don't know. I guess Betty Blue is fine for what it is, but other than that, I was just like, that could have been a much better title. And my second footnote, and it's another thing I'm going to reiterate from the beginning, is that the unsimulated sex had zero effect on me. I can understand, like, in the 80s and 90s, this being a big deal. This being like, whoa, holy crap, the actors are actually having sex on screen? Holy shit. But I don't know if it's just because of how ubiquitous porn is nowadays and how normalized it is, but when watching this, I didn't have the shock that I was expecting. Maybe because I'm older, maybe because I've seen enough of it where I'm like, okay, yeah, they're having sex. What's the big deal? But I think the impact of them being so free with their bodies and being nude all the time and the sex really didn't do anything for me in the slightest. I don't think it's bad. I'm not one of those people who think like all sex should be taken out of movies. I think at some point it was a little too much at times, but I think now we're going way in the opposite direction. I think people are starting to shy away from it, which I think is a bad thing too. I think the weird effect I had of this movie is that it didn't affect me at all. It was just like, oh yeah, okay, cool. Maybe that's something you guys can talk about in the comments. I have no problem with sex being in movies. I really never had an issue with that, as long as it makes sense for the movie. I really get like irked at movies where it's a story and then all of a sudden there is this really graphic sex scene and then it goes back to the story. I'm like, what was the point of that sex scene being there? If there's a point to it, like I think Betty Blue having it, I think makes sense. It's about a couple that is very passionate, very sexual, and they really communicate themselves through sex. And to me, that makes a ton of sense. I don't know. Like I'm starting to think now that having sex in movies is now starting to be shied away from, and maybe it really shouldn't, and I think we're going backwards on that end. What are your thoughts on that? Okay, so overall, I'm going to not recommend Betty Blue. I will say this, though. This is a divisive film, but I think it's something that is becoming a lot more beloved as time goes on. I have seen people adore this movie, but I've also seen others that don't like this movie at all. And I think just the way the film is shot is divisive in itself. I would say, honestly, if you are really into film, like I am, like you just want to see different types of films, you want to see new types of stuff, I would say see it, but I honestly came away from it not liking it in the end. I think Beatrice Dalle is incredible in this movie. I think if there is one reason to watch this movie, it's her performance. She is excellent in this movie. And I also do like the style of the film. I like how bright and vibrant it is. And for the first two acts, even though it is really slow, I can't say that I was not enjoying myself, but I also wasn't really transfixed. I wasn't really amazed by it. It's where the third act happens where I think it falls apart. And I'm not going to spoil what happens in the third act, but I think the direction that they went in makes sense when it comes to Betty, but not with Zorg. Something with Zorg, the way that they portrayed that character in the end, just did zero for me and kind of ruined the movie for me. So overall, I am not going to recommend Betty Blue. But if you do want to check it out, it is on the Criterion channel, and I think that if you are really into film, I would say check it out anyway, and tell me what you think on the comments. Now, if you want my full review on this movie, you can go to my website at IamTheWiz.com. You'll have my full written review right on the site, along with a link to the video that has this review that you've just listened to. All right, so for Thursday, me and Zero are going to review The Handmaiden, directed by Park Chan-wook. Saturday, I'll be reviewing Risky Business, directed by Paul Brickman. So on Tuesday, the Criterion Collection is having a sale on Barnes & Noble for 50% off. And I thought a great idea would be to watch some films that are in the Criterion Collection they haven't seen. So for that on Tuesday, I'm going to review the 1944 noir crime movie Double Indemnity, directed by Billy Wilder. I have been interested in seeing that. I really like Billy Wilder. I think he's a great director. Me and Kim reviewed Sunset Boulevard at the end of last year, and I like that movie. I don't think it's amazing, but I do like the movie. So I am looking forward to checking this out for next week. So to recap, Thursday I'll be reviewing with Zero The Handmaiden, directed by Park Chan-wook. Saturday is Risky Business, directed by Paul Brickman. And Tuesday, Double Indemnity, directed by Billy Wilder. I am The Wiz, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye.